and hello to Dr. Arif Shawn and Dr. Alicia Wise. Thank you so much for doing this webinar today. I would love to start by you introducing yourselves, what you do, where you are, and your day-to-day responsibilities. Dr. Shawn, shall we start with you?
Sure, I was going to say, ladies first, but sure, I'll go first. I'm Arif Shawn. I look after the digital curation, preservation, and access to a wide range of collections that Qatar National Library has been sort of accumulating over the past I would say more than 10 years. And so I have a small team who does sort of day-to-day preservation, as well as dealing with requests related to high resolution images from our collections, general creation work. So in general, we sort of look after the overall kind of the digital preservation curation life cycle of anything that comes into our digital collections, whether it's digitized or born digital. So once it's registered in our collection registry, it falls under my jurisdiction. So that's how I would describe my role.
Thank you. And Alicia, over to you.
Thanks, Gali. And it's a real privilege to be here and learning in discussion with you, Arif. So thank you for joining us today. So I'm Alicia Wise. I'm the Executive Director of the CLOCKSS Archive. And CLOCKSS it's a distributed international digital archive. We preserve academic materials published in going on 80 countries now. And the idea is that any content that academic libraries anywhere in the world value and would consider as part of their collections is eligible for preservation in CLOCKSS. And we reach out to libraries and publishers to make sure that the scholarly record remains preserved for future generations.
Thank you, Alicia. And I am Gali Halevi, and I work with Alicia at CLOCKSS as a collection development director. And I'm also, as you can see, I also take part in all of our outreach, education, and outreach for libraries and publishers around the world. And I would like to start with a question to Arif, please. We spoke a little bit about your activities in the Qatar National Library. Could you tell us a little bit about the efforts that are being made towards long-term preservation, and even why that is a priority?
Sure. I think I'm just looking at the participants. There's only 6 of us, so it could be a very, very intimate conversation. So, I mean, before I talk about the actual preservation work done by the library, I think it might be useful to talk a bit about the library and its collections to kind of set the context for the preservation work that's happening. So, in case you weren't aware, we were just talking about this before the webinar started, that the Qatar National Library is one of the newest national libraries in the world, if I'm not mistaken. So it was specifically designed and built to support the country's transition from its heavy reliance on hydrocarbon-based economy towards a more sustainable knowledge-based economy. This is in line with the Qatar National Vision 2030, which identifies sort of several key areas in which the country needs to strengthen itself to attain an adequate level of sort of sustainability. But as you can imagine, because we officially opened our doors to the public back in 2018, so it's literally been like 7 years now. But even before we sort of opened the physical building, the library recognized that much of Qatar's history was sort of held in archives across the world, Europe, Asia, and beyond. And this is mainly due to how do I put this? Rather complex colonial past of the country, which is not too dissimilar to that of some of the other countries in this part of the region, at least. So thanks to the Brits and the East India Company. So the library kind of began an initiative which in hindsight was rather ambitious. It's called the Digital Repatriation Program. So it's actually started in 2014. With a major partnership with there's no prize for guessing, the British Library. because they have most of the content related to the region and the country. So the goal was to kind of identify and digitize and repatriate, heritage materials related to the country and the region. And this resulted into the launch of a digital platform called Qatar Digital Library, which hosts various types of materials related to cultural heritage, ranging from manuscripts to sort of letters exchanged between heads of states, historical maps. It really kind of paints a comprehensive picture of what the country and the region was back then, and then how it is, and then you can kind of fill in the gaps to see where it's at now. It's really phenomenal if you look at the country sort of and the region like 60, 70 years ago, what it was like, and now with the discovery on oil and gas and other resources, it's transformation is really phenomenal. So anyway, so this is actually the Qatar Digital Library has actually become one of the most widely used and cited research resources related to the Gulf history. But then we continue the work, and this early work has expanded into to include other partnerships with the French National Library, the Historic Environment Scotland, from whom we recently acquired several thousand aerial photos that was taken by UK and US Air Force aircrafts between the 1940s and all the way up to 80s, which actually shows how the country was physically. And that really kind of paints an interesting picture. So we've been growing our collections related to heritage materials. But in addition to that, we also launched a platform, research repository platform called Manara. I think it was in 2022, which is sort of designed to enable publishing and preservation of all sorts of research materials that are produced by the wider research communities of the country, recognizing that the Qatar has a very developing research landscape. And through Manara, I'll talk about this a bit later, but through Manara, we try to promote preservation and sort of open access to the country's scholarly output. So as these collections grew over the time, and by the way, the preservation that work that we're doing, it wasn't actually one of the library's priorities back in 2014. So it was more about getting content, building, the challenges associated with actually building the building, the logistics around it. But over the years, I think the library recognized the need to do more to ensure or safeguard its investments that had gone into developing these collections, which sort of prompted a shift from sort of just storing things initially in our local data centers towards 2018. I think we became more of a cloud-based infrastructure, which obviously provided more sort of sophisticated advanced services. But the shift was from all of that to more dedicated preservation infrastructure to ensure the longevity of the materials that we've been collecting. And in fact, in 2018, we did we conduct an external review. Well, we hired an external sort of expert to come in and do an assessment of our infrastructure in light of what the gaps were in terms of resources as well as skill sets and also technical infrastructure to do to sort of sustain these collections over the long term. And no surprises. I mean, expectedly, it identified that we needed to do a lot more in terms of preservation, because by then we had invested heavily in collecting this content from various partners. We had built a state-of-the-art digitization lab. The building had already been opened, so our physical sort of services were truly sort of living up to their potentials and promises. But in terms of the content that we had accumulated that needed to be preserved. So that highlighted that really kind of gave the early push towards setting up a robust and sort of resilient preservation infrastructure. So we did, at the end of that, that sort of paved the way for doing a preservation sort of planning project, which enabled us to kind of take a stock of what collections we had, what the gaps were in terms of the processes and policies and procedures. And I think, but it did require the pandemic for us to kind of set up a preservation system. So in the midst of the pandemic, we, because I don't know how to put this, but let's just say people are sort of more accepting of changes because they'd already sort of
In
endured
the midst
something
of a
that had
change.
never exactly. So we managed to kind of set up a pilot preservation system based on open source product called Archivemetric. I'm sure if you've come across that, and that proved to be sufficient for it to be transitioned into a production system. So I think by the end of 2020 or early 2021, we had a production preservation system in place, supported by I would say early versions of our preservation policies and procedures, which we've yet to publish, but we're very close to publishing them. But then since then, we've been working with the vendor of Archivemetric Artifactual to further strengthen our processes, optimize where it's possible, to really sort of we've taken sort of further step towards having a sort of sustainable, robust, and resilient digital preservation ecosystem within our digital infrastructure.
Right.
So that's how I would sort of describe the work that's been happening till now. And another thing of note is that, which is I'm reasonably pleased with, but I still have a long way to go. We've actually developed a file format action plan. Now, this is very similar to a file format policy that you have within a digital preservation system or preservation kind of model, but this is more of like an implementation focused file format policy. So if we're very much inspired by what you have on Pronom and as well as the Library of Congress's digital file format registry. But it sort of takes one step further. So it enables you to see what file formats you have in your collection and what you should do in terms of ensuring their longevity, but then how you do it in the context of what you have. So it's very much kind of implementation focused approach towards taking a file format and then assessing its current risk and really kind of outlining the steps that you would take from an implementation perspective to actually, have that as part of your overall digital preservation process. But we still have a long way to go. It is a kind of a living thing, but that would be one of our latest, I would say, completed pieces of work in the context of digital preservation.
Well, thank you. And it sounds like a lot of progress in such a short time, which is really, really impressive. I mean, considering the time span we're talking about. Alicia, would you talk a little bit about CLOCKSS as the preservation services and archive, with some emphasis about what makes us unique in that
Sure,
space?
and I'll try to pick up some of the themes Arif has already expanded on, because it's really quite interesting thinking about the two services. So CLOCKSS began life in the late 1990s. And it was with recognition in the academic library community that the shift from print publication to electronic publication created a particular preservation problem. In the print world, it was possible for each library to undertake preservation activities with the physical objects in its collection. But with digital licensing and copyright changes, it meant that they didn't have the rights that they needed because they didn't own the content. So it became necessary for digital preservation to happen, but in dialogue and in collaboration with publishers. So we started life as a Mellon-funded project at Stanford University. It's a collaboration between the Stanford Computer Science Department and the library. And they collaborated there to develop LOCKSS open source preservation software, which we continue to use today. And CLOCKSS spun out in 2008 as a standalone entity. So we're a not-for-profit independent charity owned and controlled by libraries and publishers around the world, because governance by that community is so important for the trust that we need to get content deposited. We hold rights to make all of the content in our archive accessible, but it's a dark archive, so we don't provide that access unless the publisher goes out of business and the content disappears from the web. And so in that way, I think we're a little bit different than a national library. It's much more challenging in a national library environment when you're thinking about how to preserve your digital collections at the same time that they're being accessed and used by people both on your premise and over the web. And that must be really difficult. It would be actually fascinating to learn more about that. So we're a dark archive. For academic material, we use open source software as well. That's really important to us. I suppose another difference is that we're not cloud-based. We actually have preservation vaults that are physically located in 12 universities around the world in places like the United States, but also Japan and Australia and Germany and Italy and other countries as well. And so we have a highly protected environment for our content. It's not accessible by people or machines, but nor is it reliant on any particular single cloud-based service provider. And we get some resilience because of the 12 different computing environments the content is preserved in and housed in. Is that what you were after, Gali?
Yes,
Okay.
thank you. Yes. And Arif, you spoke about the enormous work that you have done collaborating with different national libraries and archives to make this happen, this preservation effort. Can you tell us a little bit about what were the biggest lessons that you and your colleagues have learned from it? Something that people could use if they embark on a preservation journey?
No, it's a very good question. And in fact, as you can imagine, during the early phases of this digital repatriation program, I would say things are done on more on sort of, what was the priority at that stage. The less attention was paid to, I would say, standardizing and streamlining some of the key processes. And in fact, one of the biggest challenges we had, and to an extent still have, is the licensing and copyrights associated with this. And that's always a difficult conversation to have, because one of the main goals for repatriating this content is for our patron to have access to it as openly as possible. But with some content and some collections, there are some challenging licenses and copyrights associated with it. In fact, to this date, we have a collection that we've acquired from, it's an audiovisual sort of broadcasting collection that we've acquired from, I believe it's Associated Press, that we cannot sort of, provide our patrons access openly. So it has to be on premise and within a very controlled environment. But these conversations, are related to these topics, whether it's copyrights or metadata formats or the file formats, even the technical details of how to structure this. They weren't as standardized as they are now, and this is something we have learned through various partnerships. In particular with the British Library, as our first major collaboration, it really helped us understand our own internal capacity. There were questions or conversations that we wouldn't have at that time, like back in 2014, that we're having now, because we've sort of, in a way, we've sort of, we've have a template for setting up a partnership with a new partner that we didn't have in 2014. The focus was more on, they have content related to the region and the country, how do we get it? And all the other sort of questions related to, the copyrights, the licenses, or what sort of file formats they should have, whether they should be preservation aware, stuff like that. They all came much later. So I would say those are lessons we've learned. But over the years, throughout this sort of partnerships, what we managed to do, based on the lessons learned, or the I would say, for lack of a better word, the mistakes that have been made, and what have you, I think that all led us to kind of develop a set of standard processes, policies and procedures when it comes to setting up a partnership. So we tried to kind of emphasize on the need to have metadata in a certain format. It's mostly mods that we can then plug it into our existing processes, and it can then have sort of more streamlined post-acquisition curation before it's ready for ingest into our preservation system. including sort of, semantic and sort of a structural validation of the content we get. From a digitized content perspective, we require or we try to get the highest resolution of images possible. But sometimes it's just not possible. So we also have to be sort of, we also have to plan for the reality where all, not all partners would be able to meet our requirements. And I mentioned the aerial photographs collection earlier, and that was one of the cases where the photographs are really sort of important and relevant to the country's history and the culture, but they didn't have all the metadata that we would need to ensure an adequate level of search and discovery and reuse. So what do you do at that time? So we sort of assess the scenario and the importance of the cultural value of the material that we are getting. So this is where we have to kind of relax our criteria a little bit. So okay, let's get them at the content first, and then we do a sort of post-acquisition enrichment, which is hard work if you don't have the original metadata to begin with. But where compromises were necessary, I mean, we do the compromise, but it inevitably means that there's more work on our side. But currently we're trying to sort of trying to be smart about post acquisition curation with the help of AI. We recently had a student sort of come in and sort of try to do stuff with the AI to see if we can enrich some of the metadata, automatically identify the places, so that at least when we eventually put it up on our repository, there's a way one could search, whether it's just place names or have it sort of imposed on some kind of map to see how things are back then now. So you could have that kind of interactive kind of narrative of the things. But all of this requires metadata that we don't have. We didn't get. We got the coordinates and the mission sort of information, stuff like that. But it requires much more for it to be meaningful and useful to our patrons. But as I said, it depends on the content. But in general, I think what we've understood is that having close and transparent communication with the partner really helps. We've understood that you make it very clear that this is for at least to an extent, it's a very noble cause. I mean, we're trying to kind of give a piece of the history back to the people of this country and the region, and they're also the partner is also contributing to that as well. So it should be we're trying to present it as a sort of a mutually beneficial thing beyond the financial sort of aspects and on all the rest of it. So we try to kind of pitch it as though we are together we're contributing to the global knowledge base, and that helps with varying levels of success. With some partners the conversations are easier, so they're more accommodating. And the pitch library, we kind of in a way they've kind of helped us grow up in a way from 2014. So they're in some cases they would be more accommodating, where the new partners would be more like, we have other priorities, you understand, on the collections, but we'll try, sure, we'll help you, but we cannot do everything that you need. So it depends. But the conversation, that at least the beginning or the end, they sort of look more or less sort of standardized. In the middle, you may have sort of different variations depending on how things go, but we can begin to see that okay, we have a clear end-to-end process. This is how you would identify a set of collections at some memory organizations where there's an archive or a library. This is how you would begin the conversation. This is what we should how we should get the content, and this is what's expected. This is what this is where we register the collection in the registry. So we have now a clear sort of, well, I would say clearer sort of a visibility of how things should be done from end to end.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. And Alicia, I want to pick up on what Arif was saying about preserving heritage and preserving history. Could you share with us a little bit, what do we do and how CLOCKSS try to answer that as well and support these efforts of preserving history and heritage?
Sure. And it's actually a theme, Arif, that Gali has developed over the last couple of these discussions and webinars. So last month we were hearing about libraries in the Ukraine and the difficulties that they've been facing. And we were hearing about standards development activities to make it possible for libraries and archives and other memory organizations to surface their collections so that in a time of crisis, it might be possible to understand what's preserved where and what resources can be brought to bear to support libraries in crisis. It's quite interesting, the similarities with the repatriation work that you're doing. Because actually, if we all were able to surface our collection information more openly, be possible for us to discover points of collection connections, as it were. And as far as I know, maybe I've missed something, but there aren't standard ways for archival or library collections to be surfaced internationally for discovery, so that we can be conscious about drawing those connections and parallels. Of course, this is relevant for CLOCKSS because we have content published in so many different countries. We're interested in providing added resilience for archives and libraries in those places, not unnecessarily duplicating effort, but necessarily duplicating effort, because of course digital content is most protected and most robust and resilient when it's in more than one trusted archive. So facilitating connections, whether that's with data archives or with national libraries or with the publisher's own archive, it's really increasingly important. But have I missed something, Arif? Is there already a standard for surfacing collections information for the discovery of those connections? Or is it all done on goodwill and conversations and kind of manually?
I'd say it's more of the latter. So are there best practices or there practices? They're known practices. I wouldn't call them, depends. I mean, they may be best to some, but I think there are known practices that work well, and there are pros and cons to them. But it's more of the latter that there's. So when you say surfacing, I'm assuming you're referring to the fact that we are kind of acquiring content from another sort of the organization for the purpose of dissemination, basically. So yeah, no, I'm not aware of any standards to be perfectly honest with you, but maybe nothing comes to mind. So, but there's sort of it sort of depends on the scenario essentially. So there's no standards, but I would say there are some principles that you could probably follow. So I mean, I'm not entirely sure when you say standards, are you sort of referring to the, is it sort of the technical sort of standards, or are you talking about the sort of, the kind of the overall kind of the building blocks of the policy? So maybe you can just, I'm a little confused as to what you mean by, yeah.
Thank you for asking. And let me be clear, because it needs, of course, the policy building blocks you're talking about and the technology building blocks. Let me give you an example of where this works well. There's something called the Keepers Registry, which is run by the ISSN International Agency, the agency that assigns unique identifiers for journals.
Yeah.
And they have a technical mechanism where anyone preserving journal material can share their holdings information. And through the Keepers Registry, all of that is publicly discoverable. So it's possible to say which national libraries and which other archives are preserving a journal. And it's possible, as a result, to see where the gaps are. But I'm not aware of any other infrastructures, policies, or practices for books, digitized materials, aerial photographs, audiovisual collections, or other kinds of digital materials that enables us to systematically share information with one another.
Yeah, you're right. I think there's definitely sort of more active practices within the traditional publishing domain, as you sort of pointed out. But when it comes to cultural heritage material, or even with sort of research, content like the research data, if you will, I don't think there is. I mean, well, maybe in the context of research data, I think there is this registry for research institutions, and then you can sort of from there there's a link to their repositories, which basically identifies the different types of content they have. In fact, with the help of DUI, you can potentially sort of get a kind of overview of the different types of materials the repository might have within their sort of collections, because the DUI is a global thing, and then some of the metadata get published to the kind of the global registry where you can search for the things they have. But but not many institutions, have DOIs, especially to cultural heritage materials. So I would say no. So the way we do our partnership, but not necessarily we go and actively look within a registry. It's more to do with, I would say that, it's part of our, we used to have something called an international partnership department. And we don't have that. I think it's kind of, absorbed in another department, but there isn't sort of, active, endeavor to try and find archives and content that's relevant to our region, and try and sort of work with the respective institutions to see if we can bring them back. Sometimes it happens quite organically. Sometimes the partners reach out to us, basically saying, we have this, do you want it? In case of some of the content that I mentioned, like the Associated Press and others, there's a financial aspect to it, and it's in their interest for them to sort of, for lack of a better word, sell their content to us. So it depends on the partner. So if it's a commercial organization, then they might be approaching us. Whereas when it comes to sort of, existing established, memory organizations, for instance, we've been having a conversation with the Maharashtra archive in India for quite some time. So it hasn't quite reached that level where we could have a proper agreement. But this all happened through sort of mutual connections that we had. So we had a director here who knew somebody over there. So it's been more of the establishment of a connection or beginning of a conversation with a prospective kind of institution with materials related to us. It happens on a sort of, I don't think there's a standard process to it. It's more about identifying actively who people you meet at the conferences and so on. So I don't think there is, we're actively looking at any sort of registry to see, who's got, content related to us. But there was an attempt, and I would say I think, I don't know what the state of that is now, and QNL was briefly part of that. So there was in fact, Stanford Library was involved in developing something called the Digital Library of the Middle East, where the libraries and organizations would contribute their metadata, at least the metadata portion of their records, which would basically, idea was that you would have a global registry of content from various libraries and organizations, with materials or content related to this part of the world. So you would go and find stuff there, and if there was, things that you'd be interested in and that would add value to your collection, then you might be able to reach out because it has complete profile of the organization as well. I don't know what the state of that is, but the QNL, especially from the QDL, we contributed a lot of records to that platform. But currently, we're not part of that. But it was an attempt to potentially address the question you have, like is there kind of a global registry for things that are not sort of quite within the traditional publishing domain.
That's so cool. Thank you for sharing that, Arif. It also makes me think. Sorry, Gali, I just got excited about this. But the British Library is involved in the Dunhuang project, and Dunhuang is the name of a cave that was on the Silk Road, and when it was sort of rediscovered, I guess by historians or archaeologists, they found an intact library of ancient scrolls in many languages in this cave, very well preserved. But the scrolls were actually ripped up and disseminated to private collectors and museums and libraries and galleries all over the world. And it's physically impossible to read any of the scrolls now without connecting digitized images that are held in many different kinds of collections. Again, that all has been reassembled digitally, so you can read the scrolls now. And it was down to individual relationships, driven by user needs to be able to access this ancient information. Anyway, maybe this is one of those areas that AI will help us humans with in future.
Yeah, hopefully, potentially, yeah. But one thing to note is that we had when we had the library opening, we invited, I don't know how many countries, I think more than 30. Sort of, heads of states and also, people who are influential within the sort of the memory, sort of the sector. And they all came, and I think there was a pitch made that, this is not just a library for Qatar, but also for the region. And, we need to work together, and, we expect help in terms of not just support, not just mental and emotional support, but also in terms of the content and the. So I think that that message was received well, and that also sort of resulted into at least a few partnerships that we had, which resulted into sort of substantial amount of content that we've received into our collection. So yeah, it's combination of all of those things.
Right. And this conversation just leads us really into the next kind of topic, which is Arif, Alicia and I work really, really hard in all the areas of engagement and awareness. And I know we've spoken a little bit about the lack of awareness, right, of the importance of preservation. Could we start with you by telling us a little bit about what do you think would be the best way for an organization like ours, which is focused on preservation, to better align and work with national libraries like yourself? What would be the best approaches, you think?
For CLOCKSS to work with national libraries, yeah. I think I'm not a CLOCKSS expert, but I'm aware of the work that's been happening for quite some time. So I think the CLOCKSS can definitely play an important role in strengthening preservation efforts for national libraries, especially in this part of the world. I think the preservation as a domain or as a sort of a sector, I think has advanced well enough in the West, but there is still there's significant gaps that exist in this part of the world. I was just talking to Gali a couple of days ago when you had the conversation, because even to this day, there is this misconception among even library professionals, IT professionals, or anybody who's sort of dealing with information in this part of the world, about where they think that digitization is essentially digital preservation. So they equate digitization with digital preservation. So I'm not sure if a couple of years ago there was this ICA Congress that happened in Abu Dhabi. Which sort of covered topics all the way from digital preservation to physical conservations to sort of thefts of arts and artifacts and all these things, art trafficking and everything else. So pretty much everything else everything you can think of in the context of knowledge preservation. But what really struck me is, and we had a booth there. We had a National Library booth where we had the big poster about digital preservation. So people would come to us, they would be really sort of curious and say, okay, yeah, you do digital preservation, that's great. So what's your digitization lab like? So what do you have in there? So to them, digital preservation was immediately digitization. So that, to this day, that still exists, and that misconception needs to be, dispelled. And I think CLOCKSS has a very important role to play. But one of the things that CLOCKSS offers, I think, that's something that many institutions in this part of the world perhaps cannot do alone, which is to build a distributed, community-governed preservation network. So I think that's very important, and that kind of network sort of ensures that the longevity of the content, or the continuity of the of accessibility of the content, even in the face of local disruptions, which we've had, we've faced quite a few in recent times. Right. So I think that kind of sort of global redundancy is in a, I think it's not only sort of necessary, but also I would say it would adequately complement whatever the national level efforts there are for digital preservation. So that's one area. Of course, CLOCKSS can help by sharing training. I mean, the advocacy, providing sort of training and really sort of showing, the practical differences between what a digitization is and what digital preservation looks like. So, really kind of, sort of driving the point home that digitization is essentially the beginning of the digital preservation work. It's the digitization is essentially the first step towards ensuring the longevity of the content that is of value. So I think there's definitely a role to play in creating awareness. But I also worry that there may be a counterpoint, because many libraries, especially small or sort of under-resourced libraries, they may not have the capacity or the whether it's financial resources or human resources to really fully participate in any sort of in CLOCKSS or any of the similar initiatives. So so for CLOCKSS to kind of reach more sort of national libraries globally, at least in this part of the world, I think there's a need to sort of, articulate its value in more tangible and sort of business justifiable ways, right? So, preservation is essential, but the institutions also need to sort of see how, being part of CLOCKSS can contribute to their, like organizational maturity, a reduction of risk, compliance, and so on. So in a way, I think, I think this is the challenge with preservation anyway. So when you talk about preservation, especially with somebody who's, burdened with decision makings, budgets, and everything else, they need to see some, tangible benefits, even though it's for the long term, but how do you show value in return on investments within the short term? I think this is where, the wealth of expertise and experience that CLOCKSS has could potentially be of benefit. I'm sorry, I don't have a structured way of presenting how CLOCKSS could definitely, but these are my thoughts.
Absolutely,
it's
this
really
is
good
exactly,
advice.
it's good
Great advice, Arif. And I think that CLOCKSS plays a role, but in partnership with other memory organizations. And so if you think about a region as important and as fast changing and developing as the Middle East, we have a contribution to make, but that might be best realized if we had a strong partner in the region. We could perhaps host one of our vaults in the region and to be a contributor. I think another of our contributions is the fact that we help fund and maintain open source LOCKSS preservation software, which is available. It's free to use by any organization anywhere in the world. And it's actually used to run regional archives of various kinds. For example, the Cariniana service in Brazil is run on this free software. And I know the LOCKSS team is thinking very hard. They hear oftentimes it can be difficult to locally host the software and the machine. So they're thinking about strategic ways to provide perhaps a remotely managed service as well. So there are lots of options, us working in partnership with others, but most importantly, also working in dialogue and partnership with people in the region. I loved what you said about misperceptions, that digitization equals preservation. And here again, partnership is really essential because digitization can be a step, obviously, in preserving print collections or physical collections, but by itself, a digitized digital copy, as you well know, is also very fragile. Digital information can corrode and get corrupted. It's invisible. You don't necessarily notice unless you've got a professional preservation team really thinking about it, looking at the integrity at bit level, as you and your team do. And so bringing to life what that expertise is and why it's important in the broader collection life cycle is something, we could definitely do together. We have those conversations with people all over the world. There are also misperceptions around backups and how preservation is different than just creating a backup of your material, or sometimes the difference between storing something in the cloud and preservation functions as well. So the more of us that can be helping to correct those misperceptions, the better. And training and advocacy is so important. Here, there are other international organizations like the Digital Preservation Coalition that have a great role to play as well. And we work closely in partnership with them. So it's been a mystery, I think, to me for a long time about how best to engage with the National Library community. And that's why I particularly appreciated you being willing to come along and talk to us today. It's nice to have a friendly ear and advice and guidance from that perspective, because it's a different and important perspective.
Right. So we're going to close this webinar in a couple of minutes. I wanted to just hear from both of you any kind of final things or messages you would like to put out there regarding this, the national effort, the preservation effort, maybe what you hope for the future, Arif?
Sure. I mean, before that, I think, just quickly, you mentioned DPC. We are an associate member of DPC, and William Kilbride and I, we've been, having this conversation quite some times that, there needs to be more done in this region in terms of our, advocacy and sort of other things. And one of the things I suggested, and he agrees that we should have a big enough regional conference related to whether it's a regional one or a chapter or a version of IPRESS or something in this part of the world. Because we've been having conferences like IPRESS for quite some times, but they all sort of happen either in Europe or in the US, and I think this year was in New Zealand. It was for the first time. But because a lot of people would just, even those who have heard of preservation but just curious, they would come if it was close to their home, and that could be just a great entry point into something. They might even become end up being sort of an advocate themselves. And my final thoughts are related to that. I think we need to sort of there's no way around raising awareness. You need to be aware of a problem before you can begin to solve it, or before you even know that the problem could potentially affect you. If you don't know the problem is, that you wouldn't even do anything about it. So I think the awareness raising is definitely something, and I think the National Library, Qatar National Library has a role to play, but we are stretched thin for our resources in terms of doing the practical day-to-day things. But we recognize that's something that we need to do as well, and we can't do it ourselves. Do it alone. We need to partner up with definitely the regional, some of the the other leading institutions. The couple of them that come to mind are the King. What's the word? I mean, the KAUST, who's the King. Sorry, forgetting the
University of Science and Technology in Saudi Arabia.
That's right. Yeah, science and technology. Yeah, exactly, in Saudi Arabia. They're one of the first ones, along with Qatar National Library, to establish their own digital preservation program. So I think they're definitely a good ally in terms of getting the message across and building awareness. There have been some initiatives in the UAE as well. But with these sort of regional partners, we also need to bring in international partners like yourself, CLOCKSS, DPC, to sort of send out a sort of like a consolidated, concerted message saying that preservation is important, and also sort of kind of break it down into more tangible benefits. That how this would benefit your organization. Whether it's you're appealing to the reputational aspects of an organization or the financial aspects, but they need to be sort of presented in a way that would resonate with these organizations for them to kind of come forward and really kind of invest in whatever capacity. At least there would be sort of a beginning. They would sort of have some sort of beginning in the digital preservation. And if we have more of these sort of seeming working together, then you could begin to see a more of a sustainable ecosystem for digital preservation within the region, which could complement the global preservation ecosystem. But it cannot, the library cannot do it on its own. We do need help, and we're open to having conversations about what that could look like. But there's no way around raising awareness and then sort of transitioning that into more sort of practical aspects. And operational in operational context.
Right. I think
that vision for a preservation event in the region, and we would be happy to help.
That's good to know.
That's going to
organize that in any way that would be useful. So thank you for that very much. And in return, I think what would be wonderful, there are so many publishers throughout the Middle East and North Africa producing really important material now in Arabic, in English, in French, in other languages, and ensuring that their perspectives are also preserved as part of the broader international scholarly record, as that record of scholarship, feels really urgent and important. This is a viewpoint. These are languages that are underrepresented in archives like ours at the moment. And we want to be mindful and more proactive and systematic about making sure that the scholarly record is actually representative of scholarship that's happening around the globe. So, partnership and working together to fill those kinds of gaps would be really helpful and appreciated if that were possible.
I think both of you, have brought up really good ideas. I think what we've said about a regional gathering of libraries, but also publishers, right? That both sides
Yeah.
to come together and talk about preservation from a library perspective and publisher perspective could be an amazing accomplishment. And that could be something for next year to try and work on, right? Which is exciting.
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
Gally
that
was
sounds really
volunteering,
good.
Arif. There we go.
Yeah, here we go.
That sounds really encouraging. I just wanted to something I want to touch base, ask you both perhaps is that I'm sure you're aware of the data site model, right? So the way
Yes.
they sort of operate, and they have these sort of regional advocates and champions. I don't know what the official term is, but they have one sort of person who tries to sort of at least address the initial queries related to what is a DOI and what is beneficial, and I think a similar model for digital preservation could be considered, which should be seen as a kind of like as a complementary to DOI, because persistent identification is an important aspect of long-term digital preservation curation as well. So maybe we could partner up with already established initiatives, and then see how they could kind of help us drive the message home. So something to that effect, about food for thought.
It's a great one. And I'm mindful that DOAJ, the Directory of Open Access Journals, and I think the Directory of Open Access Books as well, they have regional champions or ambassadors as well. I met DOAJ's wonderful chap at a conference recently in the Emirates. So there are a lot of points of connection. Arif, this is great. Gally, thank you so much for creating a time and a space for us to have an in-depth conversation rather than a superficial one.
That's it. Really helpful. Much appreciated.
Fascinating. Let me stop the recording for a second.